All right, I'm going to go ahead and make a few announcements before we get started with our talk today. I'd like to welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We are so glad to have you all here to join us today. My name is Julie Bravko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. I want to announce first off that we're accepting applications for our forensic postdoctoral fellowship. We have 2 spots available for the 2021-2022 year. Please email us if you'd like our brochure. Applications are due on January 14th, and I'm so excited to say that we were just approved for the 5-year waiver. As you can see, Rachel's not here today. She's also gone next week. So what that means for you is we are going to do our very best to answer any of your administrative questions or concerns, or if you have issues with the CEU form or you want the slides, etc. All of that stuff, I promise you we'll get to it. It just might be a little while. So email us if you have issues like you normally have, like you normally do, but just know that if we don't get back to you in a couple of days, please be patient, and one of us will, or Rachel will, as soon as she returns. With that in mind, we're going to keep the CEU link open for a lot longer than we normally do. Still try your best to get that done as soon as you can, but just know that we'll have it open for a few more days. The next thing I want to do is remind you to join us next week. At that time, Vivian DeVogel will be presenting Violent Women in Forensic Psychiatry, our gender-specific approaches to risk assessment and treatment needed. Now, for our talk today, please ask your questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable. Know that we're probably not going to get to them until the end. And like usual, we do try our best to get to as many of your questions as possible, but please forgive us if we just don't have time to get to yours. For those of you who want your CEUs but are on a tight schedule, just know you do need to stay for that full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. I'll try to let you know when the hour is passed, and we will likely be staying on longer to address your questions, but if you need to be off right at the hour, that's totally okay. About 5 minutes before the talk ends, I'll be posting the survey link for the CEUs in the chat, so that's where you can grab it. I know many of you ask for the recording of this presentation and the PowerPoint slides. We try to get those out within a week of the presentation. Again, I promise you we'll send it out. If it's not within a week, please just bear with us for the next couple of weeks with the holidays and all of that. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Robert Cochrane. As the Internship Director at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina, Dr. Cochrane is actively involved in administrating, teaching, and supervising students who have an interest in forensic and correctional psychology. He has supervised and worked with interns and psychiatry residents for over 20 years, and throughout his career has taught seminars, classes, and workshops to students and early career professionals. He also teaches a case law seminar series at FCC Butner and Central Regional Hospital. Dr. Cochrane has coordinated workshops, guest lectures, and joint training ventures with other internship programs. He is a site visitor for internship programs for APA, as well as a mentor for the Association of Psychology Postdoctoral and Internship Centers. Dr. Cochrane is an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina and guest lecturer at Duke University. He's the past president of the American Board of Forensic Psychology, as well as a former board member and examination faculty member of the American Board of Forensic Psychology. Furthermore, he's a book, journal, and APA conference reviewer, and has served on and chaired a variety of committees, such as the IRB, Grants and Aid for Division 41, and Ethics. In addition to his training responsibilities, Dr. Cochrane conducts criminal pretrial evaluations for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and he consults and conducts civil examinations like personal injury and fitness for duty privately. He has testified throughout the country and has completed a number of capital and high-profile cases. While primarily a clinician, Dr. Cochrane finds time to be involved in research, including published projects on competency restoration. Dr. Cochrane, on behalf of the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and New Mexico's Behavioral Health Services Division, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for presenting today. We're so grateful for your time and expertise, and I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. I'm very pleased to be here today. I have watched a number of these in the series, another number of these presentations in the series, and they've all been just outstanding. So I hope not to disappoint today. Let's just jump right into it. Julie's already gone over my bio. I don't think I need to do that, but I'll give you this and a couple more obligatory slides here before we get into the meat of the topic. But I should point out that since I've been the internship director, I'll probably use terms like supervisee, student, or intern throughout this talk. I'm meaning them all synonymously, but obviously the terms may be different where you work. I don't have any financial relationship to this program, and the views that I present or share with you are just mine, nobody else's, not anyone at the University of New Mexico. So I have 4 learning objectives for today. Now, since there's a great deal of overlap with clinical supervision generally, some of what we cover is broad, but will be applicable to forensic work as well. But I want to start off by briefly describing the primary nature and the tasks of supervision, then get into some of the models, methods, and goals of supervision. Then we'll talk a little bit about supervision practices specifically and what I refer to as KSAs, or knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And then we'll talk about qualities that I think one needs to possess to be effective, an effective forensic supervisor. All right, so many of you probably already know this, but I want to review anyway. The primary task of a supervisor is to protect the public, right? It's to protect clients, people from harm, while simultaneously promoting the competency of supervisees. Now, in forensic contexts, many times the person sitting in front of us, like the person we're evaluating, is not exactly our client, right? Perhaps our client is an attorney or the court or another party. However, there still can be a lot of or different types of harm that can be caused. Certainly, misdiagnosis can be harmful to the individual. That can have serious treatment implications, right? Or someone doesn't get the treatment that they perhaps very much need. Or there could be a wrong legal outcome, a situation where the court makes an erroneous decision based on the work by the forensic psychologist. Or in situations of violence risk assessment, there's obvious harm that can be done, physical harm to parties, or the taking away someone's civil liberties unnecessarily. So there's a lot of different harms that can come about. So supervisors are responsible to make sure that those they supervise, protect these parties, protect these people. Now, there's pretty much universal consensual agreement, I'd say, that clinical supervision is a distinct professional competency. In fact, APA has indicated that it's a requirement for accreditation for graduate school programs and for internships, that there be some component to teaching and helping soon-to-be psychologists be competent in the provision of supervision. In fact, in 2014, APA put out these guidelines. There are 7 principles, broad principles or guidelines to providing supervision. We're going to go over these just briefly. Now, in the area of supervisor competence, obviously one needs to be competent in what they do. In fact, in the specific area in which they work. They also need, however, to be competent in providing supervision. And if they don't have the necessary competence, of course, get the training, get the continuing education that one needs. And APA also indicates that one needs to stay abreast and updated on the various technologies. In this day and age, it's just moving so rapidly that can sometimes be difficult to do, but it's a responsibility that we have as supervisors. We also need to, as supervisors, maintain self-awareness and competence in issues of diversity. And this is something that is ongoing. It's not a one-time event, but the expectation is that you will stay abreast of these matters and facilitate them in the training that you provide and the supervision you provide. And in some situations, it'll be appropriate for you to be an advocate for change. For instance, perhaps you're working in an agency or a setting where you observe or believe there's structural racism or discrimination of some kind. It may be incumbent upon you to be an advocate in that situation. Now, the supervisory relationship, it shouldn't be one where you're just teaching, telling the other person what to do or how to do something. But the expectation is that it's going to be a collaborative process. You're going to promote the supervisee's competence, but it's going to be done in this relationship, right? This back and forth. It's not a one down type of relationship. And it's really important that the expectations and that the responsibilities be laid out very clearly. That is what the relationship's going to look like, as well as what the individual or specific duties and responsibilities that the student will have. And finally, in that relationship, the supervisor is the one who's going to be expected to address any issues or problems. Now, it certainly can be brought up by the student, and they can be encouraged and should be encouraged to bring up any issues, concerns, or problems, but it's the responsibility of the supervisor to address those, not that of the student. Modeling professionalism is very important for obvious reasons, and not just professionalism in their interactions with other psychologists or like-minded professionals, but interactions with all sorts of people, whether it's courts, administrators, lawyers. You need to model professionalism in all your interactions and teach the knowledge, the skills, and the attitudes that the student that you want him or her to possess. Now, obviously, because it's a supervisory relationship, there's a component of assessment and evaluation. But in this domain, you're not going to simply just write down or give some written feedback to someone and expect them to just turn around and correct their behavior or improve their professional conduct. You really want to promote openness and transparency in the feedback. So again, APA indicates that primarily this will be done live, although it could be in recorded and in written format, of course, but you really want to have a live face-to-face relationship and discussion when it comes to assessment. And the assessment includes not just how the individual is doing, but you want to help the student or supervisee learn to assess themselves, engage in ongoing self-assessment so they can correct their own behavior and improve and develop in their own ways even when you're not present. And finally, you as a supervisor should be seeking feedback. I oftentimes will, pause at some or different parts of the relationship with the student I'm working with, and I'll ask him or her, hey, am I providing you what you need? Are you getting the supervision you need in the way that you need it? Is there something different I could be doing to help you? Because I want to make sure that you're hearing, very clearly what my expectations are and what I want you to do to move forward. So seeking that feedback, I think is very important. Professional competence problems, again, is a responsibility of the supervisor to identify when there are issues or problems and not to just assume they're going to get better or go away on their own, but to promptly remediate them. So this is where contracts, whether you call it a rotation agreement, a contract, a policy, this is where those documents and that clarity becomes very important because you're going to want to follow that very strictly for obvious reasons, I think. And then finally, the last guideline that APA puts out in this regard has to do with the ethical, regulatory, and legal issues that are involved. Now, supervisors obviously need to be aware of and communicate the various ethical matters to the student, like the APA code, of course, and as well as the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists. But more than that, they need to model ethical practice and decision-making for the students. Also, you need to make sure that both parties are aware of any potential local regulations or policies. You know, where I work at the Bureau of Prisons, there's actually an ethical standards, I think it's called ethical code of conduct, but there are standards specifically related to the supervisor and supervisee relationship. One particular one is that subordinates cannot give any substantial gifts to a supervisor. And that makes common sense, right? But they go so far as to say there are exceptions, and if you do give a gift, it can't be worth any more than $10. So that's something that's small, almost kind of silly, but if your agency or organization in which you work have those types of regulations, you need to be fully aware of them, and the student needs to be fully aware of them so as not to run afoul of the expectations of where you work. And in terms of legal issues, the main one has to do with vicarious liability. I think the supervisors need to be fully aware of what the conduct of their supervisee, what it means for them as the supervisor. There are two cases in particular that I want to just quickly mention that really highlight this. The first is Peck versus the Counseling Services of Addison County. This is a 1985 case out of the Superior Court of Vermont. And in this situation, there was a student who was working with a young man who at some point during the therapy process, he said to her in so many words, "I'm gonna burn down the family farm." And she did not communicate that to her supervisor for whatever reason. So lo and behold, what happens? He burns down the family farm. So once the case is litigated, the agency and the supervisor are sued. And the court found in that case that the agency did not, and the supervisor did not sufficiently control the supervisee, even though they weren't aware of what the individual said, the client said. They should have been more on top of what was going on, in that, what the court said in that case, and held them liable. In another case, this is a Ninth Circuit case, Simmons versus United States. In this case, there was a student, I believe he was a social worker, and he was working at Indian Health Services, and he was working with a woman for a number of years. And at some point in time, they began having a sexual relationship. Well, again, the supervisor wasn't aware. I mean, there's some debate in the case about when he or she may have become aware, but they weren't really aware of what was going on, it seems. But nonetheless, the court in that case also felt there was, and opined there was negligent oversight. While the supervisor didn't fully know, they quote unquote should have known what was going on. There was suspicious behavior apparently by the student, staying late with the client, working late, seeing her, more often than was typically the case at that agency. So there were some suspicious behaviors that the supervisor should have paid closer attention to, and had, he or she been more on top of, then perhaps the liability would have been diminished or eliminated. So I don't bring that up to scare supervisors, but there is this concept of vicarious liability. You're responsible for the behavior of your supervisee to an extent anyway. Now, while there are guidelines, while there is a significant amount of literature now that's developed in relation to supervision, the research and the theoretical models primarily apply to psychotherapies. There's very limited research on even assessment broadly. Now, I did find one study, a recent study by Danzy and colleagues, in which they looked at this model called MAST. They refer to as MAST, the multi-level assessment of supervision and training. It's basically a peer mentorship supervision approach that was used at a training clinic. And they surveyed 49 of the students, the supervisors or mentors, I think they call them, and the supervisee, the lower level students. And they surveyed both groups. And in the group of supervisees, they found that they found the supervisors to be especially helpful, particularly helpful to them. They really thought it was a positive program, especially in terms of learning technical skills like test scoring and report writing. They felt that was extremely helpful. With the mentors or supervisors, they reported that their abilities in becoming supervisors also enhanced significantly through this program. The one thing that many of them did discuss, however, is that there was more of a need for multicultural competency in the supervision process. But this is one study that sort of looked at a peer supervisory approach. But there's even less research related to forensic supervision out there. It does beg the question, does supervised practice actually work, or is it effective? I think we assume it is or is helpful, but we really don't have any solid empirical answers. But I will touch on shortly a few a few studies that have been done looking at forensic practices. We'll get to that momentarily. All right, here are many of the primary models that I've found in the literature that are out there. Now, many of these models focus on supervision of therapy, and they were developed, in fact, in that context. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I just wanted to highlight them or put them up on the screen so that if you did have an interest and wanted to follow up, you would know where to begin and how to research that. And I do have some references if that would be helpful and you want to back channel, email me, by all means, you can do that. With the psychotherapy-based models, it's really the theoretical orientation of the supervisor that informs the observation and the selection of data that gets discussed in supervision. For example, if your theoretical orientation is feminism, then during the supervisory relationship, you're probably going to be discussing things related to empowerment or power differentials and things like that. If you're psychodynamic, however, defense mechanisms will probably be, discussed, and transference and countertransference in that relationship will be discussed. So it really guides what supervision looks like. The developmental models, they focus largely on providing support to the students at the appropriate stage of their own development. Okay? And then finally, the integrative models, they include some of the developmental approach, along with looking at the various roles that supervisors take during the supervision process. For example, at some points in time, as a supervisor, you may be wearing the hat more of a teacher, where you're giving instruction, it's more didactic in nature, simply based on the task or where the student is developmentally. Other times, however, you may act more like a counselor, being more supportive in that way. Or if you have a student who is nearing the end of their training or is advanced, your role may be more akin to a consultant. So it's important to sort of gauge as a supervisor, according to the integrative models, what is needed at the appropriate time for the student. But with all these models, they're not instructional. They don't tell you how to supervise, but they're simply descriptive of the process. But that is helpful in and of itself. And then there's another model, the competency-based supervision. I'm going to go ahead and read you this slide from APA. This is coming directly from APA. Competency-based supervision is a meta-theoretical approach that explicitly identifies the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that comprise clinical competencies, informs learning strategies and evaluation procedures, and meets criterion reference competence standards consistent with evidence-based practices. Now, competency-based supervision is one approach to supervision. It is meta-theoretical so that it doesn't preclude the use of other models as well. In my view, it's probably the most consistent with forensic work, perhaps along with a developmental or integrative models in conjunction with that. And we're going to get more into that too. But before we do that, I want to review something that perhaps many or all of you learned in graduate school, because it's really important to refresh ourselves of this. And that is from the Russian developmental psychologist, you probably remember Lev, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. Regardless of the model you use, I think it's important that you remember the ZPD. And as he put it, it's the distance between the actual development level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. I think it's more simply put, it's just the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can do with help. So finding that is really important in the supervisory relationship. Now, how it applies to supervision is that it's the supervisor's responsibility to assign the student the tasks or the cases that are within that ZPD, right? Because you want to encourage and advance their learning. You certainly don't want to overwhelm them, give them too much or too complicated of cases if they're not ready for it, because you're only then going to frustrate them and their confidence will drop. That's not a good thing. But you also don't want to underwhelm them. You don't want to really stunt their learning by giving them tasks that are overlearned or too easy or something that isn't useful to their progression. Now, there are various factors that you're going to want to consider, of course, in determining what the ZPD is for the student, what their ability is, of course, the caseload, the case complexity, right? Some cases are much more complex than others, so you need to factor that in. There might be some agency policies or expectations, especially as it relates to productivity, and you need to be mindful of that. And there are various methods then that you'll use. Now, we oftentimes think of supervision as one-on-one for an hour or two a week in the office, just the two of you talking about cases, but it can be much more than that. I like group supervision. I like at least small groups working in that way that has a lot of benefits. You get to hear about more diverse set of cases. You get to hear different perspectives. So group supervision is great if you can manage that where you're working to huddle groups of students together. Whether you have didactics or what have you, you may want to assign readings or discuss readings with the students. Use that. Many times that's much easier than trying to explain especially technical things. Case consultations, I think, is a fabulous way to enhance learning and to use supervision. Depending on your situation, video recording or audio recording may be helpful, especially if you're not present or able to be present during the, whether it's the interview or what have you. Being mindful, of course, of permissions that may be needed to be granted for that. Role playing is also another great tool or method in supervision. This is especially helpful, I find, when you're doing forensic work that requires you and the student to testify. So practicing that in a role play setting is very effective, I find. And then co-therapy, co-evaluation, or modeling can be extremely useful method. Where I work at the medical center on the complex, conducting forensic evaluations and supervising students doing that, I usually sit in on the interviews, whether it's competency, sanity, violence risk assessment, whatever the case may be. I sit in with the student. Now, early on, when they're getting started, I'll be doing almost all the talking or much of it, and then they'll slowly start participating more and more. But by the end, or after they've progressed, I hope to be able to sit there and not be saying anything and letting the student guide, lead the entire process. But that allows me, though, to be actively there and participating. Allows me to give them more effective feedback, I find. Now, the goals of supervision, again, these apply broadly, but also to forensic work. First and foremost is to develop a strong working alliance or relationship. If you don't have a good, trusting relationship with the student, it's just a recipe for disaster. It really is. They're not going to trust you. They're probably not going to listen to you. And it's just going to be fraught with problems. So it's really important to invest the time into developing a good relationship, a good working relationship, supervisory relationship with the student. You also want to help them develop their own self-monitoring skills. You want them to internalize what you're teaching them so they can monitor their own development and make adjustments on their own without your presence. Obviously, there's going to be some, one of the goals is going to be simply teaching them certain skills, right? They need to have, a bunch of skills in their tool bag, so to speak, to utilize. But more importantly, perhaps, is teaching them not just what they need to know, but how to think, how to conceptualize, and teaching them about the profession and how forensic psychologists need to think a little bit differently than perhaps other clinical or counseling psychologists. All right, as I mentioned earlier, there are not many, but I want to touch on a few studies that deal with forensic supervision practices. Day in 2012 did, this is essentially a literature review, And lo and behold, he found there's not a lot of literature, especially on outcomes of supervision. But there were two things that Day did find. One is that the setting and context really distinguished forensic supervision from other types of supervision. You know, the security, for example, in correctional institutions or forensic hospitals, that can really lead to conflicting roles and different ways or different things that the supervisor needs to focus his or her attention on. Again, using where I work in a correctional setting, we are, those of us who are forensic evaluators anyway, we work for the courts. We don't work for the prosecutor or the defense. We're supposed to be neutral and work for the courts, but we're also law enforcement. We're federal law enforcement officers. And when when times call for it, we need to do security-minded things where we work. And that can involve defendants we're evaluating, putting us in some potentially uncomfortable, awkward, or conflicting roles that we need to manage and figure out. So things like that Day was pointing out. The other thing he pointed out, that the distinguishing feature is that with forensic supervision, you're often dealing with more challenging populations. That's probably fairly intuitive. You know, many of the individuals in forensic settings have criminal histories or substance abuse problems or, you know, personality troubles and whatnot that make them a little bit more challenging to work with. In the Eisenhard and Muse-Burke article from 2015, this was a survey, and this was a survey of interns in a variety of different settings. And they found that the students reported that the supervisors in the forensic or correctional settings place more emphasis on professional behavior and conduct and institutional sort of matters than perhaps other issues. But overall, they didn't find any differences in the supervision style or the competence of the supervisors. Nicole Lazarus-Cococo, she was a former intern I supervised, and she presented findings from a study she did at the most recent APLS, and hopefully it will be published at some point soon. But she studied or did a survey of forensic psychologists. And in her survey, she found a lot of things, but here I just want to highlight a few. She found that about half of the forensic psychologists actually had formal training in supervision. Now, I suspect that the younger generation, that's par for the course these days. But I know when I was in graduate school, that wasn't offered. Supervision, wasn't considered, an essential course or class that we had to take, or it wasn't even offered. So I imagine there's an age difference there, but only about half actually get formal training in supervision. Also, only about half use a contract, or whether you call it a rotation agreement or whatever, rotation descriptions, there's different terms. But I was a bit surprised by this. I think, in fact, it's a little alarming that only about half are using a contract. I would argue that you should always use a contract. You should always have everything in writing in terms of the expectations. Now, you can't necessarily specify every little thing that will be done on every single day, but you should have at least a broad contract outlining what the expectations are and the goals and so on. It was nice to see that 100% have an open door policy. They're pretty available to the students. And this last finding I thought was interesting. The most common problem that supervisors identified with their student was the poor self-appraisal that they had. I guess they either under or overestimated their abilities, which made supervision somewhat difficult. And I have a situation where this was never more true for me. It was one of the more difficult situations I've been in as a supervisor. When I had a student, she was did conduct a competency evaluation on a criminal defendant, and I was supervising her. We had to travel to another state to go testify. We were subpoenaed by the prosecutor in that situation. And we got there, did all the prep, that was typically done, and felt ready to go. And she got on the witness stand and she testified. And there's no other way to put it other than to say she did a horrible job. I was cringing in my seat. It was very uncomfortable. She was saying things that we didn't really do, and said things that weren't true, and it was a mess. The prosecutor was mortified, put me on the stand after that, and I tried to sort of put it back together. But that wasn't the worst part. When we were done, we're out of the courtroom, we're going back, I guess, to the hotel or wherever. I'm thinking, well, okay, when do I talk to her about this? Trying to find the right time. So I decided to ask her, before saying anything about what I thought, just to ask her, so what do you think? How do you think it went? And she said to me, I think it went pretty well. And that's the moment where I felt like, oh my gosh, she totally didn't see what I and others saw in that courtroom. She didn't have any good sense of her behavior and how she did. So that, we obviously had to discuss that, quite a bit more once we got back. But it really, it's one of those areas that can be challenging for a supervisor when the supervisee doesn't see themselves as you see them. It takes a little extra work. Excuse me. Now, in terms of forensic competency-based supervision that I was talking about, many of the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, I believe are encapsulated in the American Board of Forensic Psychology's core competencies. So the board, a while back, I'm not even sure what year they did it, but they developed 8 foundational and 8 functional competencies that they believed are essential to good forensic practice. And of course, there are important competencies then to teach our students, right? Now, they overlap to some degree with the APA guidelines, but I think they offer more specificity in terms of forensic work. And I'm not going to go through each of these 16. I just wanted to put them up here. You certainly can go to their website and read more about all of them. Just as an example, though, I'll point out 1 or 2. The one, maintain professionalism, what they say there is that while it's important to maintain advanced knowledge, right, in the area in which you work, but they also recognize how one needs to recognize how information that you use can be used by different people. In other words, the assessment that you use, you need to have an appreciation for how others, i.e. courts, attorneys, third parties, how they might use the information. For some of you who do criminal work, or not just criminal work, I guess, but those of you who go to court quite often, you may know that records often get subpoenaed. Well, does the student, understand, or do you understand what to do if you get a subpoena from an opposing side for your test records, for your test data, for example? How do you manage that? How do you, engage in professional behavior, but still be responsible, following the ethics code and so on? So it talks about some of those matters in terms of, a competent, good forensic practitioner will be fully mindful of these issues and behave in professional ways. In terms of functional competencies, you can probably quickly see that many of these are relevant to forensic work. The first one, for example, assessments with multiple sources. The specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, for forensic psychologists, highlights or talks about this one at some length. And the essential point here is that assessments, whether they're criminal or civil or what have you, need to view data or view, how should I say this? Use multiple sources of data to see the issue or the problem from different perspectives. In other words, you don't want to just take the individual whom you're speaking with or evaluating and take that at face value, but you need to verify it with lots of different sources of data if that's possible. This might not be true in other clinical settings like psychotherapy, where the client's perspective is really the key thing, but in forensic work, using multiple different sources is essential. And then just jump to the last one. The psychologist, forensic psychologist, needs to recognize the different roles of practitioner and advocate. Now, in many cases, in the forensic work we do, we are not to be an advocate for one side or the other, not in a litigated case anyway, but we're simply the practitioner. We're the evaluator, the person who is providing information or educating the court or other party. But really appreciating and recognizing that for both psychologists and supervisee is very important. Now, the KSAs are going to vary somewhat depending on your area of practice. Now, whether you're doing fitness for duty, child custody, criminal work. It's going to look a little bit different, the details anyway, but it'll be very important for you to identify and spell these out clearly for yourself as well as the supervisee. And I took competency to stand trial as just one example. So if you're supervising in this area, perhaps this is what it would look like. In terms of knowledge, you're certainly going to want to make sure the student has an understanding of the relevant statutes, the standards, and the legal opinions related to competency. You know, the Dusky, of course, is the, for those who work in criminal work, is the standard that Supreme Court articulated in 1960 that you certainly want to be familiar with. But depending on your the area you work, let's say you work in a hospital, like where I work, we get a lot of situations or cases in which the individual declines treatment, but involuntary treatment might be indicated if the person's going to be restored to competency. In which case, then I certainly make sure the students are familiar with the Cell v. US 2003 case, which articulates the criteria under which someone can be treated against their will to be restored. So it'll depend on your situation and setting, but you want to make sure the intern is fully, intern or supervisee is fully aware of the opinions and statutes relevant to the area of competency. In terms of ethical considerations or issues, you want to make sure, again, the specialty guidelines in the APA code are followed, but let's say it's a private practice situation, you want to make sure that the supervisee is fully aware of the problem with contingency fees and how that should be avoided and how to avoid that. Or test security, how to maintain test security when records are subpoenaed and things along those lines. You want to make sure that they're also fully aware of any measures that should be used or could be used. Forensic assessment instruments or FAIs could be appropriate to assess the individual's competency, so the student needs to be fully aware of them. They need to be aware of the literature behind the instruments, as well as validity and reliability matters and things along those lines. And you want to teach certain skills, right? With competency, you're going to want to make it clear to the student that, you know, you want them to be a good diagnostician. You want them to be able to diagnose well and interview well. Virtually all standards of competency are predicated on the individual having a mental problem of some type, of mental illness, a mental disease, a defect, whatever terms are used. So they certainly need to have skills in that area. They also need to be able to assess the relevant competency criteria during the clinical interview, or during the interviews, excuse me, forensic interviews. So you need to make sure that they are skilled in that and how to do that. Again, if FAIs are indicated, you want to make sure that they don't just know about them, but that they can reliably administer them. So you're going to have to observe that, teach that, make sure they have those necessary skills. And if they do criminal competency work, you're open yourself up, excuse me, you open yourself up to testifying, whether you want to or not. So you need to make sure that they, the supervisee, is an effective witness, right? An effective expert witness. So you're going to want to help teach them to manage their anxiety, right? Because that's usually one of the biggest obstacles to testifying. How not to be defensive when they answer questions, or how to avoid certain traps during cross-examination. You know, those are some of the skills that you'll want to teach in that domain. Excuse me. And then there are the attitudes. You certainly want to convey and impart that this type of forensic work requires some degree of neutrality and objectivity, at least as best as one can manage. How I often see this playing out is in the reports that I review, like the drafts of the reports that a student will write. I have sometimes read reports, and when I'm done reading it, I pause and I will say to myself, you know what? This student really didn't like that defendant. You know, I get the sense they didn't like that defendant. And that tells me that the tone or the language used in the report suggests that perhaps they weren't being completely objective or neutral. So we'll go back and we'll address that and discuss that. That's how it's manifested oftentimes anyway, is in the reports. But you want to help them sort of maintain that objectivity. Similarly, I refer to as having a good judicial temperament is important in this line of work. I think it's an important attitude for, again, specifically for competency work, but in other areas of forensic work too. Helping the intern to be somewhat dispassionate and detached, certainly from the outcome. I often tell interns, I try to set myself up to not care whatsoever what the outcome of the case is. My job is to educate the court, share my opinion. Now, it's okay to be passionate or advocate for your opinion strongly, but you shouldn't be an advocate or worry about who's going to quote unquote win or lose the case. That's for the lawyers to fight out. That's for them to, you're just playing your role, and you need to avoid that, but just approach it again in as a detached manner as you can. You also need to give some attention to helping the student address or challenge any biases or assumptions they may have. And we all come with biases and assumptions. And, you know, thankfully, there's been some good literature recently on various biases in the field and how to address and manage those. But, you know, one that I often see, again, in law enforcement setting anyway, is that students, you know, they, or interns, they have sometimes what I call prosecutorial bias. You know, they're in a correctional setting, they're law enforcement, they might be subpoenaed by the prosecutor in that particular case. And there can be a pull sort of to bend your opinion, not to be dishonest necessarily, but to bend your opinion and your findings to be such that, you know, you lean to favor a prosecution stance. Or perhaps if you work in a private setting, you know, allegiance bias could be come into play, and you need to help the student avoid that. And allegiance bias, what I mean is that there can be a tendency to offer an opinion that's consistent with the attorney or person who hired you, because you want to, you know, certainly we all want to get paid and keep our referral sources happy. So there can be a tendency to sort of skew your results to please them, and you need to avoid that as well. So there's various kinds of biases that you yourself need to pay attention to and then bring to the attention of the student. All right, where are we? I'm going quick because I don't have an audience to interrupt me. So hopefully I'm doing well on time. Just a few more slides here though, and then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for questions. So over the past several years, I've tried to identify qualities that I think make for effective supervision. They're not all, these aren't all my ideas, what I have learned and gleaned from other supervisors as well. And some of these I've already mentioned or alluded to, but I want to go over them and lay them out. For obvious reasons, you got to understand and really pay attention to the function and purpose of supervision. Don't lose sight of that anyway. We all know it, but you don't want to lose sight of that. You want to remind yourself of that. When I was talking about the developmental approach to supervision, this is what I'm getting at here, is understanding where the trainee's at. Scaffolding is another term for it. And you want to gear your supervision to the needs of the student. You know, you might have, or might be inclined to, hey, I got to teach and train my students all to be able to do this, you know, kind of work. That's understandable, but they don't all come at the same, with the same skill set. So you may have to move more slowly. You may have to modify your supervision for some interns in order to get them to the place that you eventually want them to get. So just being mindful and not treating them all as if they're the same, but they all have slightly different needs and come ready for supervision at different places. You also need to be a good supervisor, understand the legal and ethical issues that affect the relationship. And I'm talking about the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee. Boundary issues are one in particular, and the issue of student self-disclosure. You know, do you expect, for example, that the student will disclose personal matters to you, right? Now, I think most of us would probably agree you don't go fishing for personal information, but what if the student is struggling or their work is being impacted and you suspect it might be for personal reasons? Do you bring personal things up then? Or how do you address that? How do you sort of touch on that without crossing a boundary? Because it's not therapy, right? Supervision is not therapy, but there are some parallels, but it's not that. But you want to be supportive, and you want to, help someone if they're struggling in a personal way that's impacting their work. I had, this wasn't a forensic context, but I had a student an intern whose father had recently passed away from cancer. And what I had noticed in her work at the hospital, the prison hospital, where there are a lot of cancer patients, she was avoiding meeting with and talking with certain inmates, or asking even certain questions for those she did meet with, because she was struggling so much with her own loss, with the loss of her father. So part of the discussion that we had was, not me probing her for, oh, how are you doing, and personal things about her father or anything like that. But I did have to touch on how she was dealing with the death of her father and how that was impacting what she was doing. And I had to sort of follow her lead, and ultimately made some recommendations for her to get, start seeing a counselor in the community if she thought that would be helpful, which she was planning to do anyway. But, it's a delicate situation. It's a delicate matter. How much do you talk about your own personal things? How much do you disclose about your family or whatever? There's just things just to think about. We're not going to be able to address all this today, and that's a whole nother topic, but you really need to think about boundary issues as well as other ethical matters that come into play with the relationship that you're having with the student. And I'd always encourage everyone to have a model for supervision. Be intentional. You got to be prepared, have a model, and have a plan. You may have heard the phrase, a master clinician is not always a master supervisor, right? Just because you're good at what you do doesn't mean you'll be a good supervisor. You really need to think through and carefully about how you're going to approach supervision, what your KSAs or model is going to look like, and then put that in clear written form and discussion with the student. I mentioned this before, work on relationship building. That relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee is very, very important. I think, spending a little bit of time with some self-disclosure, with some humor, not always being about business really helps, do some of that. Again, keeping boundaries in mind. But if you have a strong working relationship, then the feedback you give, this is like, again, a parallel to therapy, I suppose. The feedback you give is going to be received. It's going to be heard, and they're going to do something about it, or they're more inclined to anyway, if they trust you and they feel like you're someone they can go to when they need something, as opposed to someone who's going to be critical or harsh or unapproachable. You want to help them, with that said, you want to help them transition from this academic, at least, especially if you're working like at even the postdoctoral level, but internship level. They've been in this pretty supportive environment for the most part. Psychologists tend to be kind, nice people. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings many times. And I'm not suggesting you try to hurt anyone's feelings, but forensic work is a little bit different. It's adversarial, right? It's certainly, they're going to be in situations they're not going to be very comfortable, and they have to be able to manage that. And if you're coddling, and I hate to use some of these terms, but if you're babying or coddling the intern too much, that's not doing them any service either. I think you need to help them see that, this is not always an easy context in which to work, right? And help prepare them for that. And that can take many different forms. And again, I'm not saying being harsh, don't be critical. I'm not suggesting that, but I think you do need to help them strengthen that spine, right? Be tough in some extent, and let water, roll off their back like a duck, or else they're going to have a difficult time, or else it's going to be a difficult area for them to work in if they take everything or a lot of what they do personal. You also, as a supervisor, want to develop the ability and flexibility in giving feedback. Now, I think one of the biggest reasons people have trouble giving negative feedback anyway is because we all want to be liked. We all want to have a good relationship. We want to be liked. It can be hard. It's easy to give great feedback, right? Oh, you're doing super. You did this great. That, but it's much, much more difficult to give criticisms. But we need to do it. We have to do it. They expect it. So this doesn't mean, though, that you just, oh, I praise them when doing something well and I criticize them when they're not doing something well. But it means you need to be thinking about, how am I going to give the feedback, right? Some people may need to be, spoken to more directly. Others, again, may need a little bit of hand-holding until they're ready for, some other kinds of harsh feedback. Some may need for you to spell it out in very simple, concrete terms, or give them lots of examples or something like that. So you yourself need to be flexible. Don't assume that every student, you can just be yourself and treat them the same way. I think as a good supervisor, you need to really focus in on, how can I adapt myself? Just like you adapt yourself when you're seeing one type of client or defendant you're evaluating, and you might see someone totally different the next hour. You're not always the same with that person, right? The same should be true for the supervisees. You need to be flexible and you need to adapt so you're meeting their needs. You certainly need to be familiar too with the methods of your evaluation. You should have an evaluation plan. You should go over that plan, not just at the beginning, but perhaps at different points of the relationship, so that the student is fully aware on what you're evaluating them on. Because the number one complaint time and time again, and sorry I don't have the citations, but I know it's out there in the literature because I've seen it. The number one complaint is always, I didn't know I was being evaluated in that area, or that they didn't apply that fairly. That's the number one complaint that students have from supervisors. And with that said, or it goes hand in hand with this point really, you need to carefully review that rotation agreement description or whatever, and these procedures with them, and answer any questions they have. Or if they, if it's not applicable, maybe you cross that one out and, you revise it or what have you, but make sure that everything is crystal clear between both parties. I like to give both good and bad examples of notes, reports, treatment plans, what have you. I don't want an intern or student to simply do it how I do it, because I think I do a fabulous job. I don't. I do okay, but I want them to develop their own style. And sometimes that means reading lots of different kinds of documents from different people. Some good, some that I think are perhaps very bad, because I want them to develop, again, their own approach, their own style. And by seeing these different examples, I think it allows them to do that, build their repertoire, so to speak. With forensic work, I think across the board, there are deadlines, statutory deadlines or other deadlines that have to be met, and there are consequences if they're not. So you need to be very specific with the student or the supervisee about when things are due. Sometimes it's helpful to give them a heads up, or hey, if it's due on January 10th, I would like a draft of the report January 3rd. So I have a week to review it, we can discuss it and so on. But sometimes you can be very concrete. They might not appreciate the importance of timeframes. I think it's really, really important to talk to other supervisors and colleagues about your training. And I'm not talking about gossip. I'm talking about, your own sanity and your own development as a supervisor. It's important to talk to other supervisors, other colleagues, especially if you have a student who's struggling, because you don't want to be in it alone, sort of dealing with this difficult situation. But get advice, get support from people that you trust, because that'll make you a better supervisor. It really will. A few more here. I think this too is one of my I didn't put these in order of importance, but if I would have, this would have been on the first page. I like to encourage students to make mistakes. Now, obviously, they know they're being evaluated. They want to put their best foot forward, and I get that. Impression management, I too want to impress the boss, so to speak. but it's really important that you communicate to them that, you know what, you're here to make mistakes. You're here working with me because you're not yet perfect, and that's good, because if you were, I wouldn't have much to offer you, right? So you really want to, I guess, be transparent or with your own mistakes perhaps, and encourage them to make mistakes, because the last thing you want is them to conceal things that are problematic. And I've seen that before, where they were too afraid to talk to a supervisor or tell them something, and then they got themselves into deeper water. You want to make sure that they feel comfortable disclosing to you when things aren't perfect. It's important to discuss diversity issues between the two of you as it may be appropriate. Oftentimes, this might be difficult or hard to do, especially if the relationship is just getting started between you and the student. Sometimes it's easier to discuss diversity issues as it relates to the clientele or defendants or whomever, and then perhaps bring it into any discussion about the two of you if that's relevant. And you want to make sure that, again, you don't get, and I see this with young professionals, young supervisors when they're first starting out, they're good at teaching the content. This is what you should do. This is how to do it. No, don't do it this way. Hey, try this way. But they sometimes forget to discuss the broader issues, the process, the attitudes that I referred to or we talked about earlier. So don't get stuck in content, but also consider the process. And with that said, or again, in conjunction with that, help them to think like a forensic psychologist. Forensic psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, we don't think quite like other clinicians, right? And perhaps shouldn't. There's a different way of viewing cases and people and the clientele and the third parties that you work with. And these students need to appreciate and understand that as well. So you need to help them think more along those lines as well. All right, well, maybe I am okay on time. I have 2:58, and that brings me to the question phase. Julie, did you have any questions that were brought up that I could try to answer?
Yeah, we have lots of them here. So let's see. Regarding vicarious liability, how does this apply to practicing professionals who want to develop expertise in forensics later in their career, who don't have time to enter or complete a formal postdoc program? Do you have recommendations for how to acquire relevant supervision for those who are coming to forensic practice mid-career?
Okay, so yes, I guess there's a couple ways I can think of. One is, even though it's a financial burden, you can pay. You can, if you can't find someone who will do it on a pro bono basis, a forensic psychologist that you respect or know. The American Academy of Forensic Psychology and the American Board of Forensic Psychology are really good about connecting people if you want to do that. But you could always pay for supervision if someone's not able to do it out of the because they're already doing other pro bono work or what have you. If you're entering forensic work later in your career, there's lots of course, continuing ed and workshops, things like this, that you certainly can and should do. But you definitely want to get with someone when you're starting to work on cases. And there's a first for everybody, right? We all start off somewhere where you need a mentor, you need a supervisor. And unfortunately, many times when it's later in your career, you don't have the structure of a postdoc like was mentioned, that built-in sort of thing. But there are plenty of good forensic psychologists, forensic psychiatrists around who will work with you, who will help you. And now in this digital age, it doesn't even have to be in your local region, right? I mean, it could be across the world, and you can benefit through, sort of video conferencing or whatever, talking about cases and getting that kind of support and mentorship that I think is critical for everybody, whether you're early or late career.
Okay, this next individual says there seems to be overlap in language of competency-based supervision and multicultural competency, which I noticed was not included as a model of supervision. Is the competency-based supervision driven by multicultural theory?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can specifically answer that, and perhaps it was a point that I could have embedded in one of my slides. Multiculturalism and diversity, I think, should be embedded in any and all models of supervision. I know there is multicultural models per se, but I think whether you're approaching it from a developmental, competency-based approach, multiculturalism and diversity, you need to be well versed in it as a supervisor, and you need to have it be part of your conversations. It needs to be part of your evaluation too. And as I think about it, I could have put a sample or two evaluations up. Maybe that would have been illustrative to do that. But most evaluations I've seen include a component, actually, the ones where I work do for sure, they can include a component of multicultural assessment and treatment and other interventions, because you want to make sure that the students are well versed in, as you should be too, in providing multicultural, competent multicultural assessment. So I see it as embedded or potentially embedded in many or all models. Not that some of the models I talked about are explicit in that regard, but I think whatever model you adopt, it absolutely needs to include thinking along the lines of multiculturalism and how diversity impacts relationships and the work that we do.
This next individual would like to know if the federal system requires forensic evaluators to be certified to conduct evaluations for federal court cases. And is supervision of new evaluators part of the certification?
So no, you do not have to be certified per se to conduct forensic evaluations in the federal system. You do, however, the statute says you have to be a licensed psychologist, or I think it's licensed psychologist or psychiatrist is how the statute reads. Now, in terms of if you're working with the Bureau of Prisons doing federal, and I was that what she was saying or he was saying? If you work in the Bureau, you have to be identified as a forensic psychologist. That's an actual position description, and position one obtains. But there's not a certification process per se. You don't have to like take a test or prove to anybody. You don't have to be board certified, nothing like that. If you show that you have the requisite skills and experiences, you can become a forensic psychologist. And there are various things built in to help support those new young people, but there's not a certification process.
This next individual is curious about the preponderance of harm, threat, and misdiagnosis regarding interactions with and assessments of clients that you alluded to, and they would like you to comment further on those.
Can you repeat that, Julie? I'm trying to wrap my head around what exactly they want to know.
It says, I wondered about the preponderance of harm, threat, and misdiagnosis regarding interactions and assessments of clients that you alluded to. Could you comment on this? Harm,
misdiagnosis. Okay, well, what I mean is that we as supervisors need to make sure that first and foremost, we protect people from harm, right? Now harm can, as I was getting at, can look a little different in forensic cases, because typically in classical situation, you don't harm the client, right? The therapy client or whomever it is, that is foremost the important thing. So if a supervisee, for example, is doing something that is potentially harming a third party, the client, the court, or whatever, you as a supervisor have the responsibility to step in and make sure that doesn't happen. So that's the point I was trying to make, is that we are liable for what the students and supervisees do. So, and our responsibility is to make sure no one gets hurt, right? And I don't mean physically, but necessarily. But that's the most important thing of being a supervisor, is protecting others from harm. So if you have a student who's not performing well or adequately or dangerously, you have to do something as a supervisor, or you're going to be liable.
Before we get to this next question, everyone, it is a little bit past 1 o'clock. The link for the CEUs have been posted in the chat. So go ahead and grab those if you need to hop off, but we're going to continue with questions. So the next question is, in training supervisees, how do you balance and improve students' general clinical competencies and more specific forensic competencies? A sound clinical foundation is obviously imperative to good forensic work. So if a student is on a forensic internship rotation or placed in a forensic practicum site, and they're observed to have concerning deficits in basic clinical skills, how do you foster and properly scaffold both?
That's a good question. And I've seen it. They're not quite ready for the forensic particulars because they don't have the foundation. They don't have a good grasp of, let's say, diagnostic, intricacies. So what I do in that situation is, while I want to still try to get them the forensic experiences they expect and want, we might need to remediate or back up. We will need to remediate or back up. Whether it's because they can't competently administer a WACE, or they don't understand the diagnostic distinctions between bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder, whatever it is, we, or I as a supervisor, would back up and make sure that they get more training, more education, more reading assigned, to them, a number of different things I'd probably do to make sure they had the foundational skill. Because as the questioner pointed out, you're going to be a terrible forensic psychologist if you're not a good clinical psychologist. If you don't have a good grasp of psychiatric illness and substance abuse and head trauma, have a decent understanding of these matters, you're not going to be able to apply the clinical information you have to the legal question at hand. So it definitely, forensic work is predicated on sound clinical skills. So I back up. To their dismay, perhaps, or disappointment, and we might have to formally do a remediation or informally just beef up their skills in the area that the clinical area that's lacking.
All right, for this next one, I'm paraphrasing a little bit because the question is a little confusing, but I think I got it. So this individual says that self-disclosure when we're working with supervisees, it needs to be guided by rules. They point out that they often, it seems like in general non-forensic context, it's basically guided by similar rules that is used in psychotherapy. And then the individual is asking, in the context of forensic psychology, do the same rules apply or are there other rules around self-disclosure?
So I think I perhaps know what they're getting at. I recall when I entered a master's program that the school that I went to, they were obligated to tell me and the other applicants that if you choose to get into our program, you're going to have to participate in group therapy, right? It was a clinical master's program I entered, and it was the expectation about, so that was fine. And the reason that was fine, it was because it was adequate informed consent, essentially. They informed the students, if you would come to our program, this is an expectation. This is the rule or the expectation. So going in, you knew, okay, I'm going to have to disclose some things in this group supervision that they want us to partake in. And it wasn't done by faculty, but people off site. Similarly, if you at any agency or institution expect a self-disclosure per se of personal information, you do have to provide informed consent for the intern or student or whatever. You do have to abide by that rule. Now, when I say self-disclosure, we don't have rules, for example, where I work that if you come here, you're going to have to open up about your personal life. In fact, we don't intentionally have any expectation like that. It's only when the student shares it, him or herself, or there's a problem with their professional conduct that requires us to at least make an inquiry and a referral to, if they're having substance abuse problems, they would get referred, to certain individuals for that in the community, or therapy if that was indicated. But we're not permitted where I work, and I would suggest most places are this way, that you're not permitted to have the students self-disclose if they don't wish to. But if they wish to and they share, then that's on them. And oftentimes students I work with, I model sharing a little bit about myself and my life and my family a little bit because I'm comfortable doing that. Not everyone else is. But I found that by doing some of that, they drop their guard a little, feel more comfortable, and it helps the overall relationship. But that's not everyone's style. That's, I guess, just my peculiarity.
The next question is, how have you handled instances where you disagreed with the conclusions reached by your supervisee, for example, regarding competency, especially when their argument is reasonably sound?
Uh-huh.
And how would it change if they are signing the reports independently?
So if there's a disagreement, bottom line disagreement, we'll obviously have a discussion about it, right? I tell the interns, I'm open to being wrong. I've been wrong many times before. Tell me why I'm wrong. Let's work through it. Let's talk. Let me hear your arguments. Here's my side of it and my arguments. And usually we can reach an agreement. But if we don't, at the end of the day, and they are a supervisee under my license, then I have to make the call. I can't let them say, you know, something that I can't sign off on because it's my license. Now that would, I haven't had to do this, thank God, but I suppose, you know, you just have to write a separate report or an addendum or explain it somehow to the court, I suppose, that we couldn't reach agreement, but I'm the supervisor and this is why. I suppose something ugly like that, you know, to be fully transparent, but ugly might have to happen. But hopefully, you know, again, I almost always we can reach some kind of agreement. But if not, I would, my opinion would have to prevail. Now, if they're independently licensed and they're coming to me and I'm supervising them or providing mentorship to them and they're signing the report and I'm not signing the report, well, then it's on them. Despite my feedback, you can take it or leave it. You know, I disagree with you. You better, you know, now you get other sort of matters. What if I'm subject to subpoena? Well, they could sign the report and say one thing, but what if I get subpoenaed? Then I'd have to go into court and say I disagreed with her or his opinion. But that's just the way it is, I guess. But if it's my license, I'm afraid it'd have to be my opinion at the end of the day. But I'm open to being, you know, changed, my mind being changed.
Do you have any specific tips or suggestions other than what you mentioned for pre-doctoral forensic supervision versus internship postdoc tips? So I'm thinking more like practicum students versus internship or postdoc.
Any tips? Well, even internship is generalist training, right? That's an expectation for all internship programs. Now, all internship programs have their own unique, you know, whether you're a VA or a forensic hospital or whatever, your own unique context and people and activities, but they should all be generalist. So the way I see it is if you're a practicum student, all the more reason to get the foundational clinical skills intact. Now that's nonetheless during practicum is a great time to get some exposure to these different populations, pretrial populations, child custody, whatever. Start getting, you know, accustomed to working with them. You're maybe not doing things independently, right? Or learning all the, you know, ins and outs. But I think practicum, from my perspective, is a good time to sort of get your general skills under you while just getting some exposure to some of these forensic issues and matters and cases. But save the specialization to really postdoc. You know, again, internship can help you and does help people with forensic work. There's lots of different forensic rotations, but you got to get the foundational stuff done first. And I encourage, if anything, I encourage people to slow down and not be so quick to specialize. I see sometimes students going through and feel like they've got to specialize right out of the gate. And you know, before even internship comes, they got all these forensic experiences. I really don't think it's necessary or even indicated in a lot of situations.
All right, our last question for today. Do you think the supervision experience differs depending on the security level of your institution? This individual is currently at USP Allenwood, but was trained at FMC Lexington, where the inmate populations and experiences are very different.
And I missed the first part. Would I do something different? Would I supervise?
Do you think the supervision experience differs depending on the security level?
Yeah, to some extent. Because of the population. Now, I think this, you know, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of a good example, but I certainly theoretically can see how the supervision would look a little different based on context. And even though those are two prisons that the person mentioned, the context can still be a lot different because the populations are different and the type of work they do is different. So I would think the supervision could look different. Now it's still going to be supportive. It's still going to be scaffolding, there's still going to be other things that are going to be common, but you might have to, for example, if you're supervising someone at Allenwood or at the U.S. Penitentiary, which is, some pretty hardcore criminal folks there, you might need to focus more attention on personality disorders or how to manage criminal conduct or manipulation. There tends to be a more manipulative population there, things like that. So I can definitely see how it could look a little different.
All right, thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic, and we got a lot of comments also coming through just about how grateful everyone is that you presented on this topic today and how it was needed. And so sounds like our field wants a lot more of this. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone who solicited questions and watched today.
All right, everyone, we're going to be on for about 5 more minutes. So go ahead and copy that link or put it somewhere, fill it out, whatever works for you. Other than that, have a great week and we will see you all next week. All right. Thanks, Bob.
Bye-bye.